Welcome to this video on observational studies versus experiments. Statistical methods are driven by the data we collect. We typically obtain data from two distinct sources, observational studies and experiments. In an observational study, we observe and measure specific characteristics, but we don't attempt to modify the subjects being studied. We can conclude that there is a correlation between two variables using an observational study, but we cannot determine causation. In an experiment, we apply some treatment and then proceed to observe the effects on the subjects. In an experiment, we can determine causation. Let's look at this table that compares and contrasts observational studies and experiments. As you can see, when you do an observational study, you are simply observing without applying a treatment. In the case of an experiment, a treatment is being applied. Since a treatment is not being applied in an observational study, you can use historical data or study events that have already occurred. You cannot do this with an experiment since there's no way to apply treatment after events have already happened. And lastly, when we're talking about observational studies, we can say that there is a correlation or a relationship between two variables, but we cannot prove causation. The only way to determine if A causes B or if B causes A is to use an experiment. Correlation means that we are establishing a relationship between two variables, but it does not suggest causation. For example, you might be able to prove that there was a relationship between diet and exercise. That is correlation. Correlation does not mean that diet causes exercise or that exercise causes someone to be on a diet. That would be causation. Conversely, causation establishes causality between two variables. So, for example, you might say that the medicine that you take is making your headache go away. Let's look at this example. To assess the level of development among 3-year-olds, a researcher observes them playing with peers for an hour. Is this an observational study or an experiment? To answer this question, we need to simply ask ourselves, is a treatment being applied? The answer is no, a treatment is not being applied. This person is simply observing or watching these children play, and we're going to assume that they are playing the exact same way, whether or not they are being observed. In fact, to control for the fact that sometimes people behave differently when they are being observed, researchers will sometimes use a one-way window where the one side is a mirror and the other side is a window, so that the subjects being observed, especially children, might not realize that they are being watched. So this first example is an observational study. Let's look at another example. To assess the level of development among 3-year-olds, a researcher randomly assigns a group of 20 3-year-olds to two groups. One group is given a set of blocks and the other group is not given any toys. Is this an experiment or an observational study? Again, to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves, was a treatment applied? And the answer is yes, a treatment is applied, which is that one set is given, or one group is given a set of blocks to play with. Therefore, this is an experiment. The last thing to note is that in an observational study, everything proceeds as if the researcher had not been present. Again, even to control for the fact that sometimes people behave differently when they're being observed, sometimes observers will use a one-way mirror. Conversely, in an experiment, the researcher actually makes changes to the environment. So for here, for this other example of the experiment, the researcher is giving this group a set of blocks. They are applying a treatment. Let's do some more examples so we can get more familiar with these concepts of observational studies and experiments. Before we do that, I want to introduce one vocabulary word, which is placebo. This is a treatment or substance given in place of an actual drug or treatment to control the effects of a person thinking that a treatment is helping. That's called the placebo effect. Here's our first example. Over a 4-month period among 30 people with bipolar disorder, patients who were given a high dose of omega-3 fats from fish oil improved more than those given a placebo. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? Pause this video and think about that. Write your answer on a piece of paper. To answer this question, we first have to determine, is there a treatment that's being applied? And the answer is yes, a treatment is being applied, which is that certain patients are being given fish oil. Therefore, this is an experiment because a treatment is being applied. Let's move on to another example. Again, I encourage you to read the question, write down your answer, and then unpause the video and see if you are correct. The leg muscles of men aged 60 to 75 were 50 to 80% stronger after they participated in a 16-week high-intensity resistance training program twice a week. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? Again, we first have to ask ourselves the question, is there a treatment being applied to the group of these men? The answer is yes. A treatment is being applied, specifically a high-intensity resistance training program that these men are attending twice a week. Therefore, this is an example of an experiment. Let's do another example. Among a group of disabled women aged 65 or older who were tracked for several years, those who had a vitamin B12 deficiency were twice as likely to suffer severe depression as those who did not. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? Pause this video, write down your answer, and then unpause the video to see if you are correct. Again, is a treatment being applied? And the answer here is no. There is no treatment being applied. If the problem had said that these women were being given vitamin B12 supplements, then yes, a treatment would be applied. However, we are simply observing this group of women and finding out whether or not a vitamin B12 deficiency is present in these women. Therefore, since we are simply observing, we are not applying a treatment, this is an example of an observational study. Let's do another example. In 2001, a report in the Journal of the American Cancer Institute indicated that women who work at nights have a 60% greater risk of developing breast cancer. Researchers based these findings on the work histories of 763 women with breast cancer and 740 women without the disease. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? Again, we have to ask ourselves, was a treatment applied? Pause this video, write down your answer, and then see if you are right. The answer is no, a treatment is not being applied. Therefore, this is an example of an observational study. Notice that the word history is also mentioned in this example. The fact that we are working from data that is already past suggests that this must be an observational study, since there's no way to go back to the past and apply treatment to women who are being studied. Let's do another example. In 2002, the journal Science reported that a study of women in Finland indicated that having sons shortened the lifespan of mothers by about 34 weeks per son, but that daughters helped to lengthen the mothers' lives. The data came from church records from the period 1640 to 1870. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? To answer this question, first determine, was a treatment applied? The answer is no, a treatment was not applied. Therefore, this is an example of an observational study. We know this especially because the data is coming from church records from the period 1640 to 1870. This is something that's already happened in the past, therefore there would be no way to apply a treatment. We are merely observing what has already happened. Let's do one more example. Some gardeners prefer to use non-chemical methods to control insect pests in their gardens. Researchers have designed 2 kinds of traps and want to know which design will be more effective. They randomly choose 10 different locations in a large garden and place one of each kind of trap at each location. After a week, they count the number of bugs in each trap. Is this an example of an observational study or an experiment? Again, are we applying a treatment? The answer is yes, a treatment is applied, which are the different kinds of traps. Therefore, this is an example of an experiment.